Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Petra Cicvaric, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to the second panel of the Atlantic Forum's Spring Conference. Thank you to each and every one of you for being here with us this weekend. We're very pleased to be able to welcome those of you that have been with us for a long time now, as well as those who are new to Atlantic Forum and those that might join us. As you already know, this conference marks the 72nd NATO anniversary and the second anniversary of the Atlantic Forum, and we are proud to be able to celebrate them all today with you. In recent times, it has become a truism to think and to say that we live in exceptionally unstable times. Both for our security and well-being, the world seems to be as unpredictable as it has ever been. The challenges that arose with the COVID-19 pandemic have forever changed the way we see one another and the world around us. But despite the social distancing, it has also brought us as allies and partners closer. Therefore, tonight we will tackle NATO's external relations and further focus on how the alliance can advance its strategic interests while also discussing the women, peace and security agenda. Namely, for NATO to advance its strategic interests around the world, it needs to create constructive, like-minded partnerships that will support and drive its goals at the global stage. The panel will explore how NATO engages with its international partners and accelerates to achieve its goals. In this discussion, at first glance, gender may appear to have little to contribute, since security studies are traditionally associated with realist schools of thought. However, the injection of gender promises to open two key areas of understanding that are relatively new now. Namely, it locates women as a group within security studies, and by giving this gender awareness a political edge in a form of feminist international relations theory. However, it is important to stress that gender international relations is not to be restricted to the biological gender, but rather the classification to two genders is a result of a cultural act of construction. Gender is therefore not part of the natural process, but is a discursive construct. What it means is that it categorizes of a man and woman are the result of a web of language, knowledge, power, which established relatively small biological differences into major criteria for social relations. Therefore, feminism as a critical theory challenges our fundamental understanding of security, a conceptual shift opening the field to ideas traditionally associated with the female. It will be emotional, interpersonal, spontaneous, and even unstructured. Since NATO, as an intergovernmental military alliance committed to international peace, sees the integration of gender perspective as one of the methods to improve operational effectiveness and to help provide the most appropriate response to crises, it does not simply suffice to uncover the androcentrism of mainstream. Therefore, this panel will, among topics of engagement with international partners, look at the general contribution a feminist analysis can make. Why is there the need for a gender-aware analysis? What are feminist security concerns? And how does feminist IR school look at security studies? To explore these topics, I have a great pleasure to welcome the following speakers. Mrs. Claire Hutchinson took office as the NATO Secretary General's Special Representative for Women, Peace and Security in January 2018. She's a high-level focal point on all aspects of NATO's contribution to the women, peace and security agenda, with the aim to facilitate coordination and consistency in NATO's policies and activities, and to take forward implementation of. The lady to us tonight with us on the panel is Corey Flasser. She's a national security policy analyst with Booz Allen Hamilton.
I think is really working its way through NATO now, so that we're changing terms like manning. We're changing terms that make an more inclusive approach to the work that we do. The challenges, and I'm being very fast here, but I want to give Corey some time to speak as well. The challenges that we have, I think, still run to the lack of understanding of how it is adapted to security. And there's still this misunderstanding that this is about women. And this is about just increasing numbers of women, which I've said, which it's not. And that it's about development, or it's about humanitarianism, but it's not. The genesis of Women, Peace and Security was about getting more gender perspectives into security, peace and security. That's at the heart of it. And that runs the gamut of protection, participation, prevention, all of those wonderful terms. So we have lots more work to do. We have to be a little bit bolder as we move forward, a little bit more forceful. But I think we have a really good foundation that's been set, and so excited to see where NATO goes next, because I know it's going to go much further.
I'm really happy to hear that, because we, as you said, we have gone a long way, but we have a long way to go at the same time. But looking from this perspective, Corey, from your operational and field experience on these matters, how would you see the situation on the ground, and how to better integrate that gender perspective into operations themselves, the missions, the crisis and conflict analysis, education and training even as well?
Wow, Petra, these are very huge and complex questions. So thank you so much. And again, I will try to keep my comments short, but I think, the experience that I come from is on contract as the gender advisor from U.S. Africa Command. And so much of what we did was trying to advance the meaningful participation of African partner militaries, inclusion of women. We also did capacity building events that would address different topics such as rule of law, human rights, standards of conduct, how to apply a gender perspective into military operations. Because women, peace, and security is such a global issue, and there's all kinds of different lenses you can look at it through, but the gender perspective one is quite powerful and helps us understand human behavior from a military perspective in ways that actually makes operational effectiveness happen on the ground. So I think some of the ways that I have been quite successful are looking at the integration of a gender perspective in the military planning process. Policy is great. It gives the right and left limits for military, but plans are sort of what tells the military what they can and can't, or what they will do essentially on the ground. And integrating a gender perspective into your understanding of what the operational environment is tells you how gender informs your friendly actors and your adversarial actors. It's what the military talks about in terms of the human domain and the importance of understanding humans and the complexity of humans. It allows us to unpack the power differences between gender, race, ethnicity, and other intersecting identity characteristics. And then it allows us to tailor tasks to address those dynamics that we might encounter in a military operation. So, for example, some of the tasks could include, protect at-risk men, boys, women, and girls, or enable freedom of movement for host nation civilians. So I think this is one of these areas that has really helped militaries take these higher level policy initiatives that might not seem like a security issue, and take them into words that translate into action on the ground that they're therefore responsible.
Thank you for these insights and remarks made. I'm sure that our participants appreciate them highly. I would like to continue with this aspect, but address it to both Jamie and Andrew. If we look into this change that NATO has done from going from solid defense alliance to security alliance, to what extent does the collective security provide the coherent and effective alternative to reliance on the balance of power and alliance systems? Whoever would like to take I'm not going to assign it.
Well, Madam Chairperson, you probably should exercise your dictatorial powers in selecting either Andrew or I to go first. Well, I think the first thing to say, of course, is that we live in an age where you can't do security by yourself any longer. I mean, so many of the new challenges that we face are transnational. Everybody's affected by them, whether it be pandemics, you mentioned in your introduction, of course, COVID, whether it's climate change, which is now belatedly, but thankfully onto NATO's agenda. We've been dealing with cyber attacks, we've been dealing with resilience, and all of these things for some time. So the first lesson, I think, going from the old collective defense, where you could basically fulfill your mission against a given threat in a given place from a single adversary to what we face today is the fact that NATO has great assets, which are very, very useful, but they are best used when they combine with other assets. For example, when I was still at NATO dealing with cyber, I quickly realized that unless you could talk to the private sector and get them to give you cyber intelligence, forensics, help you to clean up your systems after an attack, with our own internal resources at the time, we weren't really able to sort of deal with this type of thing. If we spoke, and Andrew is the expert on this, but if we spoke about Afghanistan, it's clear that if the military can't work with the civil society, NGO community that often have been on the ground longer than we have and know more about the place than we do, especially after we've arrived, if we can't work with the development agencies to secure jobs, to introduce governance in areas where governance doesn't exist, the military can stay there for several years, spend billions of dollars, lose thousands of soldiers killed tragically, and still be back at sort of, the point of departure at the very end. So I think your question is a very good one, and it simply means that NATO has to become a more attractive partner that others want to work with. And what Claire has been doing, particularly on the women, peace and security agenda, has certainly made NATO a much more connectable and attractive partner for a lot of other people, and we need to see how we can mesh our own sort of defense military instruments with those of others in a way that we can achieve something that's going to be self-sustaining and not simply collapse the moment the troops go home. So that would be my initial sort of thought on this issue, but I'll leave Andrew to say all of the good things that probably I should have said but forgot to say. But thank you for inviting me onto the panel this evening.
Yeah, and thanks very much for inviting me as well, Petra. It's a pleasure to be here with such distinguished colleagues on the panel. Jamie and I have, I've had the privilege of being on panels with Jamie before. I absolutely subscribe to everything that Jamie has said there. I think it's worth remembering that, of course, NATO started life as a collective defence alliance, and that is what it did essentially up until 1990. And it then went into that transformation from defence, if you like, into more security-related issues, the out-of-area operations in the Balkans, in Afghanistan, the Horn of Africa, and other places. And that required a whole different set of skills from the militaries, both in terms of their military skills, but also in terms of what we're asking our senior leaders to do in engaging with other elements of the community, with governments, with NGOs, as Jamie has said, with other agencies, to try and produce a multi-agency solution. What I think did not work is when we put the responsibility wholly on the military to deliver that nexus of governance, development and security. That was too much to ask for, and I think Afghanistan shows that was too much to ask for, and as a consequence we're in the place we are in now. So without being able to work with other organizations, with other agencies, with other partners, then you cannot get effectively to a political solution for what is for these security issues, and it is a political solution which prevails ultimately, not a military solution. But of course now we've gone full circle, and post 2014 NATO is very much back into the collective defence issue, but the security issues haven't gone away. We now have to address both rather than one at a time. They're both there. So the military is looking hard at what it needs to do with the military instrument of power to get back into the collective defence world. But it's a much more complicated environment than it was in those days of the Cold War. And the grey zone that we live in at the moment, which you describe as hybrid warfare, demands of us that we still engage with partners across many domains to be able to achieve the security aims that we're seeking to achieve.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the remarks. As you mentioned, the 360-degree approach is not just in terms of geography, it's essentially the holistical approach that we need to combine and push forward essentially to make all our values and goals being heard and realized in the end of the day. So building on that aspect, Mrs. Hutchinson, why is it important for NATO to integrate the gender perspectives into policy formulation, so policy planning processes, in the security and defense field in particular. So what will be the advantages of doing so?
Thank you. And these are great questions. The idea that when we're talking about the whole of population or whole of population approach, especially if you're looking at it in an operational setting, you can't miss out 50% of the population and expect any kind of security policy to work well. And the idea that we have in the past, prior to 2000, when the first resolution from the UN was adopted, we simply thought that women just weren't a part. They didn't have an engagement, and the same with IR theory. They didn't belong in international relations theory. They didn't have a role in it. They didn't create war, and therefore they had no voice in it. If we miss out the opportunities to have a wholesale understanding of security and the risks and threats, and then we're not going to be able to respond adequately. So some things that we're looking at is integrating gender into work like counterterrorism. If we don't understand that women are both agents as well as victims, we're putting ourselves, our nations, and our partners at peril. We have to get better at really fully understanding what women, peace and security is. And so by driving it through the policy that would then reach down into the operational field, we can make ourselves better prepared. We can do a better education and capacity building. We can recognize that the risks to security are multifold. And women aren't just standing, holding hands, singing songs around a tree, right? They are actors of violence in many cases. And so we have to be aware of this. We have to drop the essentialism approach. We have to really push into the policy area so that we can be and do the most robust work that's possible. And right now, we're just not there enough. We have to get better at really embracing women, peace and security and feminist principles. Just because, we have women, peace and security or women on tables doesn't mean we're following feminist roles of pushing past all of this. So we can't move forward if we don't recognize everyone has a role and everybody has to have a voice in the security and defense of our nations.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for those remarks. I remember when I was doing the organized crime studies back in the university, and I'm not too sure which exactly the time frame it was, but back in Latin America, the law wasn't that women can commit organized crime acts. Simply, and then the whole process started booming within the region, simply because technically it was legal, in a way, I would say. But building on those remarks, again, I'll go back to Corey and your operational experience. How does the gender-sensitive humanitarian programming approach during and right after the disasters and crises enable the Alliance to fulfill its resolution 1325? In particular, when it comes to the relation to its 4 fundamental pillars?
Great. So let's start with what the 4 fundamental pillars are for the Women, Peace and Security agenda, which is the participation of women in peace and security structures, the increased protection of women and girls from violence, the prevention and response to sexual and gender-based violence, and then the increased access to relief and recovery. And so when we talk about gender-sensitive relief and response, particularly in a humanitarian or a disaster setting, I think what we're looking at is how did you plan in advance to account for some of the gender dynamics and gender things that would make people more at risk in a disaster setting. And so when we talk about militaries working together in advance of a disaster to prepare themselves, engaging with women's civil society organizations to understand different things that make women and men in that community at risk, and to account for that in the planning, should they have to go in the aftermath of disaster, is one sort of example that I would use. Also, examining the fact that sometimes there are parts of being a woman in a society that would make them more predisposed to die in the event of a disaster. I think we've seen during tsunamis in certain areas, some women or more women died in certain areas because they weren't taught to swim, because it was a cultural norm for them not to learn how to swim. And so that put them at a higher risk, or that their clothing hampered them for swimming because that was the culturally appropriate clothing. I think another preparedness aspect is working with civil military coordination to ensure that you know how to refer somebody who is disclosed to you that they are a survivor of sexual or gender-based violence. How do you work with other international actors in the area as a military person in that place to make sure that you can connect that person to the right resources if you, as the military provider, are unable to do so. So those are just a few examples that I'd say on the preparedness front, and I will stop there because I recognize that we have a lot of other questions.
We do have a quite an agenda to go through, but I really appreciate the time restrictions being followed. Building on creation of meaningful and effective partnerships in this complex world that we're living in your respective opinion, Mr. Budd, should NATO be looking to expand its membership and partnerships further? If we look into the early works of Michael Brown and Roland Danreuter, who argue that Russia has always looked unfavorably on the survival of NATO and its gradual encroachment on Russia's borders, and that the expansion of NATO towards its borders is essentially a nudge in a sense that Russia is still a threat. So it's not really promoting reconciliation. Do you think that's still the case? Since obviously we have EC members of NATO whose historical experience with the Soviet aggression has kind of led them to translating those previous experiences to the modern times.
I mean, again, you asked some pretty complex things in there, Petra, one way or another. I think it's NATO's partnership program began at the summit in London in 1990, whereby we turned NATO from an alliance of confrontation to an alliance of cooperation with former adversaries. And I think that was the spark that lit the PFP bulb, if you want, in 1993. So the partnerships, the PFP sought to help those former communist Warsaw Pact countries to come into the world that we know, and we were able to teach them about democratic control of the armed forces, about the balance of investment in armed forces and security in terms of overall investment for a country, how to procure, how to organize, because all these are the things that had been done for them. And it was a consequence of all that many of them then sought membership of the alliance and, of course, of the EU as well, as they sought to pursue a different security agenda to the one which has been imposed on them for a very long time. At the time, NATO and the West more generally recognized the challenge or the fact that Russia was going to be part and parcel of the future, and hence the move towards the NATO-Russia Founding Act of 1997, which was provided for a unique partnership with Russia, but one that was based on trust, transparency, and respect for values. And that is what NATO has sought to do with Afghanistan, and in terms also with not within the NATO construct, but certainly within the coalition construct, Japan and South Korea were both part of the post-conflict reconstruction in Iraq from 2003. So I think NATO has been pretty transparent in the way it has addressed partnerships, the way it has reached out to partners, and the way it has dealt with Russia. Everything has been done in that context. But nonetheless, you can understand, if you're looking at it from a Russian perspective, that you suddenly have these Western liberal democracy aims surrounding your territory. And if that is not how you wish to run your country or the regimes you wish to impose upon your people, then you are bound to see that as a threat. But that should not stop NATO seeking what it wants to do in partnership terms.
Well, thank you for your remarks. Respecting that Mr. Hutchison has a personal responsibility to leave us in some 5 minutes, I'll let you just ask a final question, but kind of merging the two questions in one, if that will be okay. So we talked about incorporating the feminist foreign policy into NATO, and what will be the key challenges of incorporating the feminist foreign policy we'll be facing, and how can we genuinely, us in this panel and later on in discussions, inspire or promote the collective political will for NATO to consider adopting the feminist foreign policy into its creation. And if you could just do a quick short remarks on encouraging our professionals in the end of it who are interested in foreign policy, to encourage them possibly adapting a gender perspective in their own works, and then being an advocate in their big education, be it work scenarios to help us promote it further.
One of my favorite questions, any question that has the word feminist in it. The biggest obstacle getting feminist foreign policy into anywhere, and especially into NATO, is the word feminist. Because there's a lack of understanding of what the word feminist means, and which actually means just about equality, that women and men should be equal, have equal rights and equal opportunities. I think it's had a bad rap over the years because of the different schools, from radical feminism to socialist feminism to, different strands of theoretical feminism. But because it simply means equality, and because we've seen the traction starting with Sweden, Canada, my own country, that's adopted a feminist international foreign aid policy, and recently Mexico, one of the newest nations to adopt feminist foreign policy. I think the idea that it's simply just looking at how does a nation do that intergovernmental, cross-divisional approach. You can't do gender, you can't put gender into anything, and you can't have any kind of approach to women's peace and security if you don't pay for it. So the baseline of feminist foreign policy is making sure that you have gender budgeting, that you're funding from a gender analysis, that everything is funded because what you pay for means it's important. And that we could, and I do see us, I believe in NATO, we do. I say we have a feminist action plan, because we're putting gender equality principles into everything. The only part we need to do a bit better is probably fund a little bit on, and nations need to look at that as well in terms of their own gender policies. But coming from national action plans, a feminist foreign policy, I believe every policy should be feminist. I believe all foreign policy and defense policy, and what I'd love to see is a strive past foreign policy into defense policy, because I think that has opportunity to look at about equality and how do we put the principles into the work we do in defense. And so just in terms for young professionals, I didn't start out as a militant feminist. But I became one because I saw that in many cases I was treated differently as I moved into my career, of things that were offered to women that were offered to men. And I think as we move forward, it's different now, which it's lovely to see. But I think we have to be vigilant about our language constantly, about how we do inclusion, about how we think about questions, and I think about who gets to speak. I raised this the other day. I was astonished to see in our internship program, a young woman and a young man, both were seated, and a question was asked, and the young man answered on behalf of the young woman. And this is 2021. So I think we have to remember that gains made can be lost. We still have to fight to make sure that everybody has space, and that is a safe space to speak and to be. And that policy cannot be made when some voices are quieter than others. And so for us all to be feminist, to be ardent and arch, to be bold and be courageous in making change. And that doesn't mean it has to, but doesn't belong. It belongs specifically in areas where it's not. Further into those fields, be it STEM, technology, works in terrorism, into cyber, into the areas which it's not a commonplace. That is where we have to be a little bit more strident to get gender equality into. But I think the future is bright, and I think we have come a very long way, societal. you know, despite Sofagate, I think we still have a lot of possibility to make great change. And I just think we have to recognize the value that gender equality can bring to everything, as opposed to be frightened of the change that it is going to incur.
Well, thank you so much for your warm and encouraging words at the same time. As I said in the introduction as well, gender may appear to have little to contribute to security studies and defense studies and STEM areas, but we do have a say, and what traditionally has been associated with doesn't necessarily mean that that's the only future and the only alternative. So on that positive note, I would really like to thank you for your participation and for your time. It's been more than valuable, and it's been a true pleasure. And I hope to welcome you sometime soon as well.
Thank you very much. I'm so sorry I have to run, and it's been a real pleasure. It's been lovely to see everybody else, and I know Corey can take these questions and just blow you out of the water with them. So I think she's going to do a fantastic job. So thank you, everyone. Ciao, ciao. Bye-bye.
Thank you. So following on this, I would like to refer us back to the questions of membership. We've discussed Russia in particular when it comes to the enlargement. The recent changes that were happening in both the Arctic Circle and the militarization when it comes to the Ukrainian border more recently. And considering that the NATO-Russia Council has been postponed due to the Ukrainian crisis, how can we build a constructive relationship with Russia, considering these surges, and also considering that China has recently increased the cooperation with Russia when it comes to the strategic cooperation, and that even some apparently seem to be arguing that China is a threat to its interests and hegemony that is currently happening in the Indo-Pacific. So do we still have the time, or we are a little bit too late to see how far will Moscow push? I'd like to ask this question first to Mr. Jamie Shea, following by Mr. Andrew Budd, if that's okay.
Well, yes, I mean, this is obviously the big strategic question at the moment. It's impossible for NATO to cooperate with Russia if Russia's committing aggression. There's a clear red line there. And that's why, obviously, NATO will be very worried, like everybody's very worried at the moment, at the Russian military build-up along the border with Donbass, in the Crimea, in the Black Sea. Fortunately, this time round, we're not being taken by surprise. I think back in 2014, when Russia used hybrid tactics, remember the little green men, to annex Crimea, we were taken off guard. But the advantage this time, of course, is that everybody is communicating with Putin. Virtually every Western leader has been on the phone to him. I think it's fairly clear to him now that if he continues any aggression against Ukraine, there's going to be a high price to pay in terms of sanctions, further isolation of Russia. Its economy isn't doing particularly well at the moment, so Putin has to ask himself if he can really risk that type of behavior. The Ukrainians also have received a lot of help from the United States, from Canada, from European NATO member states, from NATO itself. So their military forces are in much better shape now to resist than they were back in Crimea in 2014. So I don't know what Putin's intentions are. I don't think anybody does. But certainly there is a lot more crisis management going on now in 2021 than there was back, regrettably, back in 2014. The second part of your question is Russia-China. Well, yes, they do seem to be having a bromance at the moment, and Putin at the Valdai conference a couple of months back even suggested that they could form an alliance. We'll see if they do so, but certainly they are working together. Most of the cooperation up to now has been in Asia, particularly exercises in the Far East. That's where it all started. Shanghai Cooperation Organization, of course, in that region, and joint flights in the North Pacific. But I think, one thing that NATO, and maybe Andrew will comment on this, one thing that NATO will be watching is if Russia manages to draw China in more to a presence in NATO's immediate vicinity. You mentioned the Arctic. There have been some joint manoeuvres in the Mediterranean between the two, and of course in the Baltics. But the Chinese are very intelligent, very sensible, which is the reason why they've risen to be a very preeminent power. Their main interest in Europe at the moment is selling technology. It's in investments. It's the soft power. The promotion of their vaccine at the moment in Eastern Europe and in the Balkans. It's the supply chain issue. They're a global trading economy in a way that Russia isn't and isn't going to be. So whether the Chinese really have a strategic interest in allowing Russia to draw them into a more confrontational stance vis-a-vis NATO in Europe at a time when they're facing already a big pushback from the United States over standards of democracy, well, I wouldn't expect Beijing to automatically follow the Russian line. And even Russia has to ask itself in the long run, if it forms an alliance with Beijing, is it going to be the junior partner? The last time the Russians did this was in 1950 in the Sino-Soviet alliance, when Mao Zedong's China was very much the junior partner at that time to Stalin's Russia. And Stalin made that very clear to Mao, which is the reason why by 1956 that alliance had collapsed. This time the ball is on the other foot. The Russians will be very, very, very much the junior partner to the Chinese, particularly when it comes to exploiting Russia's natural gas and energy resources. So I question, beyond the short-term tactical gain of poking an eye at the West, which they probably both enjoy doing, but I wonder if in the long-term strategic framework this thing is going to last. But NATO, of course, has to keep an eye on it. So the interesting thing today is that NATO has to look at Russia, it has to look at China, which is very much on the NATO agenda, but there's now this triangular element in the sense that it also has to look at Russia and China together, which is why I think NATO's next strategic concept, which is announced for the end of this year, is going to be a very, very interesting exercise. I only wish I was still at NATO to participate in all of this, but age, unfortunately, puts an end to all of our ambitions.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for the remarks. Mr. Ingerbert, would you like to take the floor as well?
I think the first thing to say is 10 months' time, Jamie, then I'm aged out as well. So I'll be no longer part of this either. Jamie has illustrated quite well there the incredible complexity of these interrelationships, and there are other areas as well that one can look at in complexity. But addressing the Russia bit, I agree wholeheartedly with Jamie. You can't have a meaningful dialogue with someone who is pursuing aggression in the way that Russia is at all. And I can also confirm what Jamie has said there about NATO watching this very carefully indeed. As it happens, I coordinate the Crisis Management Task Force, as it's called. So I know that we are looking very closely at what is happening in and around Ukraine at the moment. I think it's also worth knowing that Russia has openly said that it considers NATO and the West to be an adversary. It has said it has no room for dialogue with the EU at the moment at all, based on the various sanctions that have happened over time, and not least those that were imposed after the Navalny issue. And also, recently, Lavrov has said for NATO it is either dialogue or defence, but you can't have both. So it is challenging the NATO dual track approach that we have, and clearly we're not going to neglect defence responsibilities to have a dialogue with Russia that is going to be very, very difficult indeed. So at the moment, no obvious opportunities arise, and I agree with Jamie as well. The notion of both having an interest in containing China, I just don't think comes into it. Russia's interests in China are in the Asia-Pacific region, and it pursues them very heavily through the ASEAN organization and others, the Shanghai Cooperation and its own CSTO. But these are organizations, of course, of countries that did not put any sanctions on Russia in the after the Crimea annexation in 2014, and therefore countries where it still has economic ties and also believes it can achieve security ties for that particular region, which is very important to it, whilst it has its problems with the West. And it is also interesting that Lavrov has pushed back in December last year on the Indian overtures for an Indo-Pacific region, not alliance, but grouping, on the basis sees is something that America is trying to pursue to both restrict it and China. So we are in a very complex world, we are a difficult world. For NATO, in terms of China, as Jamie has alluded to, I think there's a lot of thinking to be done on what is our position on China. And certainly China is seen as both a challenge and opportunity by NATO allies in various domains. But we are relatively late waking up to the amount of investment that has gone on, Chinese investment that has gone on in what we would describe as critical infrastructure in Europe. We have been busy mapping Chinese ownership of ports, airports, and other infrastructure. In light of the Belt and Road Initiative, and in light of the fact that virtually everything China does, all these investments in one way or another come back to the PLA to one degree or another.
Well, thank you so much for these remarks. If a similar topic, but still correlates to it, if you look into the future partnerships that NATO could potentially be creating, so if we stick to the South Asian region, for example, because we have seen throughout last year and before the heated tensions happening between India and China, and if we take into consideration the increased strategic cooperation between Moscow and Beijing that was happening as a bromance at the moment, as Mr. Jamie Shea said, and currently the heightened that great power competition that we are seeing on the rise as we speak. Would you perceive India as a natural global partner to NATO for the, say, next decade? And do you think India will actually be interested in becoming a global partner? And if so, what will be the reason for it? Should we go with Mr. Jamie?
Yeah, and interesting to get Cora's perspective from the United States on that one as well, given that the US and India have drawn much closer together in recent years. Well, one of the things I got to do when I was still at NATO was to go on a sort of semi-secret trip to Delhi. I suppose I can reveal it now because it was some years ago with the then Deputy Secretary General to talk to the Indians about the possibility of opening up a relationship. NATO was in Afghanistan, and of course that brought us very geographically, at least, closer to India. India has lots of equities in Afghanistan, so it was good to talk to them. We sat in the office of the Indian Foreign Minister at the time, and at the end he said, "Yep, okay, I can see the rationale. We'll open up a dialogue with you." And we flew out the next day. They never did. They quietly buried it. They obviously had cold feet and they had second thoughts. And it's true that now there's a lot of press articles being written in the Indian press and also by prominent Indian think tankers suggesting that it's time for the government to go back to that notion of having a dialogue and a partnership with NATO, particularly at the time, of course, when, as Andrew says, NATO is looking at China. The Secretary General is talking a lot about developing closer relations with the Pacific partners of the alliance, more NATO countries, including even Belgium. Small Belgium have been sending frigates to the Indian Ocean to have joint exercises and so on. But whether the Indian government really will go down that track, I'm not sure. The Indians, I mean, their traditional foreign policy since independence has been very much to balance. And maybe during the Cold War, that balance went quite close to the Soviet Union, of course, their major arms supplier. Maybe over the last couple of years, that balance has swung more back towards the United States with the US-Indian nuclear deal a few years ago, with the formation of the Quad, this new US-sponsored arrangement, which includes India and, of course, also Japan and Australia to look at Indo-Pacific security, with the US stepping up its arms sales. But that said, in Delhi, from my experience, they still like to keep the idea of a balance. For example, recently they've had talks with the Chinese on de-escalating the situation in the Himalayas, pulling back their forces, and so on. The Indians also look to China for investment and so on. They still have quite a close relationship with Russia. Lavrov was in Delhi just this week, and arms sales. So it's going to be interesting. I think the Indians will obviously increase their bilateral cooperation with NATO countries, hence the ships, a very close relationship with France, the sale of the Rafale fighter jet by France to India. The Indians are going to be, they're going to have one of their feet much more implanted in the West. But whether they will want to go the whole hog and open up a relationship with NATO, while they're still very much trying to keep good relations also with Moscow and with Beijing, I think it's an open question. But at least it's now back on the agenda. It's under discussion. But think tanks don't necessarily, although I'm a think tanker these days and we try to write very good analyses, but that doesn't necessarily mean that the governments listen to us. And it could be the same with the Delhi government not listening to its own but it's interesting to watch. I don't know the answer. Let's wait and see.
If I can add to that, I don't think that India is a natural partner for NATO at all. And Jamie has alluded to the level of interest that was engendered in his trip there. So, but of course, India as a power in the Asia or the Indo-Pacific area is now of interest to NATO. But a partnership has to be something that is of benefit to both sides. And I'm sure that in Delhi, they'll be asking themselves the question, what is NATO's policy or position on China, on the Indo-Pacific region? What does NATO intend to do in the region? And what mutual efforts can there be that will achieve some mutual benefits? So the starting point as NATO as the salesman, I think, has to be our understanding of what it is we wish to achieve in that region, and how we can influence India to be on our side in achieving it. So it's very much for us to do that analysis that Jamie has already referred to and come up with what we think. I mean, and bearing in mind that Jamie has said that India has sought this balance across the board, but has also sought strategic autonomy in its region as well as a policy position. So we're asking a country such as India to shift away from that, then there has to be something on offer to make it worthwhile.
Wonderful. Thank you for these remarks. Corey, would you like to comment on it from a US perspective, or would you like to pass this one?
I will take the liberty to punt on that one because of my colleagues here who just very articulately described some of the U.S. relationships and the partnerships that we've had with India. So I will defer to their remarks.
Wonderful, no problem. So if we just stay with this topic for a short while. So if we look into, as you said, it has to be a partnership of a benefit for both sides of the partnership. So if we look into the differences and similarities that NATO shares or doesn't necessarily share with the Asian security institutions, so how will be NATO fostering the relationship with its Asian partners, considering the cultural, say, differences that shape the security concepts potentially within the region? Mr. Anjubar?
Yeah, I'm not going to be able to give you a very a terrific answer to that, certainly from the NATO perspective. Jamie may have more to say from the think tank perspective that he's in there. I come back to the point that our relationships with countries such as Japan, such as South Korea, and the attempted relationship with India going back were all based on thematic issues and not the grand strategic. at the time. And if we're now looking at this through that grand strategic lens, then it really does, as I've just alluded to, come down to the point of what is it that NATO wants to do in that region, and therefore what can it offer? And bearing in mind the added complexity of this, of a number of NATO allies pursuing their own policies there. As Corey said, the American aims and policies we've already talked about, but the UK is about to launch a fairly major naval effort into the Indian Ocean, Pacific Ocean for up to 6 months, challenging the China's claims in the South China Sea. As Jamie has said, even Belgium has put a ship into that particular area. Now, these are not done as NATO. These are done as individual nations who happen to be allies pursuing their own aims and policies. So there has to be a hard policy discussion at NATO on all this to put this into an alliance context. And as I'm not going to be involved in the strategic concept going forward this year either, but I think it'll be fascinating to see what comes out of that. What we can achieve when there are so many different opinions and national engagements with China amongst individual allies. And I say that against the background that the United Kingdom is the single biggest recipient of foreign direct investment from China in Europe, and Germany is the second largest recipient of foreign direct investment from China. So there's lots of interests at play as this goes forward, which is why it is such a challenge.
Realized I didn't press the button. Sorry for that one. So thank you for these remarks and for the insight given. Mr. Shape, would you like to comment on this one?
Well, I think Andrew typically gave a magistral overview. I think, with the Asia Pacific, NATO already has had for several years, going way back to the beginning of the 1990s, good relations with Japan. That's long-standing. We've had the Japanese Prime Minister in the North Atlantic Council on a number of occasions, more recently with Australia, New Zealand, and as Andrew mentioned, South Korea, and the participation of those countries in different ways in the Afghan mission helped to build a lot of interoperability. In fact, Australia became one of NATO's first enhanced opportunity partners as well. So the others were all in Europe, or at least Jordan in the Middle East. So there's a basis to build on. And of course, these countries have been part of the classical West, Japan in the G7, of course, for a long period, very strong ties between Australia, New Zealand, and the US through ANZUS with the UK. France, don't forget, France is an Asia Pacific military power. It was in the Pacific that it used to carry out its nuclear tests until about 20 years ago. And of course, it still has Asia Pacific possessions today as well. So, it's not as if NATO is discovering Asia for the first time. Those links go back a long way. It's true that maybe as the ISAF mission was coming to an end, some of those countries may have thought, well, if NATO's now going back, as Andrew implied, to collective defence in Europe, if it's going back to becoming an essentially European regional organisation because of the reassertion of Russian power, is there still something in the relationship for us? But now that NATO's put China on the agenda and emerging challenges like cyber, as well as terrorism, issues which, of course, as we know, confront the Asian countries just as much as they confront us. If you want to know something about cyber, talk to the South Koreans about the cyber attacks that they suffer from North Koreans. We've learned a lot from them on that. So the emerging challenges have given us an opportunity to re-engage, and of course now that China's on the agenda, which is the number one issue, of course, for the Asian Pacific countries, suddenly we're sort of reigniting the relationship, which had gone a little bit cold. I think that for the time being, what these countries are going to sort of ask themselves is, will NATO play basically an intellectual role only in our region? In other words, will it be interested in really just swapping notes on cyber threats or on pandemics or on assessment of China? Or will NATO be essentially only there as a diplomatic actor? In other words, if China starts beating up on Australia, as it has done in recent days, banning Australian beef because the Australian Prime Minister had the nerve to suggest that China should submit to an international investigation on the origins of the COVID-19 virus, then NATO would express diplomatically support and solidarity in the same way that NATO has frequently expressed to South Korea support and solidarity when it has been threatened by North Korean missile tests or nuclear tests and so on. Or will NATO want to go beyond simply having an intellectual or a diplomatic role and actually start being a military actor in Asia-Pacific security? In other words, will there be a NATO rapid response force in the region? Will NATO open military liaison offices or bases? Will NATO, keep a certain number of ships, like the UK is suggesting it's going to do at Singapore, in the region on a permanent basis? Because that will change the equation entirely. Or will NATO basically only really deal with China, as Andrew was saying, when China is present in Europe in terms of the ports, the direct foreign investments? And I think one of the questions which the NATO strategic concept has to answer is NATO's interested in China when China comes to us? Or is NATO's interest in the Asia-Pacific one that we're going to go there and play some kind of ongoing military security role because we recognise that's in our interest too? And I think the Asia countries are sort of sitting back at the moment because I think they want that big $64,000 question to be clarified. And then on that basis, they'll know just how far it's relevant and interesting for them to engage. Just one final coda as I finish, which is that, of course, there are a number of other actors in the Asia-Pacific. We are dealing with the easy ones, the ones like Japan, as I said, Australia, South Korea, that have been sort of in the West democratically in terms of values, multilaterally for generations. There are a number of up-and-coming actors in the region. Should we have a dialogue with Taiwan, as the US is now doing, because it's a plucky little democracy being bullied by China at a time when we are all trying to defend democracy against the authoritarians? What about the world's largest Muslim country, Indonesia, which is, of course, also potentially a rising power? What about Malaysia? These countries, let alone, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, these countries are, we were talking about India earlier, are much more sensitive, much more delicate, much less obvious how we would approach them. And therefore, are we going to build a relationship with Asia around the obvious guys, or are we going to try also to have some kind of arrangement, structure or otherwise, with some of the rising stars of Asia who have not traditionally been associated with the West?
Wonderful. Thank you both very much for this quite extensive answer to the question, but very timely one as well. As you've seen, there's a lot of potential rises and challenges and opportunities as well that will rise from the Asian side of the alliance. If I can just ask one more question in terms of the partnerships. So we've talked about India and many others. In your view, from where we are now, in terms of NATO 2030 and our short and long-term goals as the alliance, which states would you consider being a valuable contribution to the alliance, and in order to achieve exactly those long and short-term goals? Mr. Budd?
Are we talking in terms of a partnership or in terms of membership, Petra?
I think we can talk about both in this one, but I think partnerships will be more likely at this stage, in my view. But we can talk about both.
Yeah. I think in terms of partnerships, you can never say you're maxed out, but we are bearing a pretty heavy load in the partnership world, with the PFP program still going on, the ICI program still going on, the Dialogue program still going on, the partners across the globe still going on. In most of those, we are in the defence capacity building arena with them still. And of course, we have adopted a policy of, with our partnerships, to enable, help our partners build up their defence and security institutions to the point where they can cope with problems themselves, so that we don't have to commit forces on a large scale, as we have done in the Balkans and in Afghanistan as we go forward. So lots of efforts all the way from the governmental level down to the tactical level, engaging with partners on a vast plethora of programs that are available to them, with teams going to them going to countries, the NATO schools, the NATO Defence College in Rome, and others working incredibly hard to achieve this. So if we're going to go for future partnerships, it is, what are they for? And if we're coming back down to the really grand strategic, then we've talked about China and the Far East and where we may go on that. So I doubt we'll be looking much further than that. In terms of membership, we're almost maxed out as well. I mean, Article 10 of the Washington Treaty talks about countries in Europe that meet our values, etc., as being able to join the alliance. And Finland and Sweden clearly don't want to at the moment. So that leaves almost just Georgia and Ukraine, both of whom we said at the 2008 Bucharest summit would become members of NATO at some point in the future, and both are at various stages of preparation to do so, and Bosnia-Herzegovina. Serbia is still a bit of an outlier there, and the notion of the Balkan countries becoming allies was certainly part of American policy, as the final tidying up of the post Second World War boundaries in Europe, one way or another, once the Cold War was over, and equally once Yugoslavia as a country had collapsed. So it is difficult to give anything in any way precision on that as well. And again, once again, no doubt, I mean, the policy is that the door remains open for countries to come in. But I say there aren't that many out there who could now come in. I don't know if Jamie has a different view on that, or a different, or at all.
Sorry, Patrick, if you turn to me, just also to say that after this answer, you'll forgive me, but like Claire, I have to jump off slightly before the UN, because my dinner is about to begin with my family arriving. So I have to go and do that. But I know we're towards the end of the time anyways, but forgive me if I have to sign off just a couple of seconds early. No, I fundamentally agree with what Andrew said. I think that, the key thing on enlargement is to get the Ukraine and Georgia piece right, which is really to handle that. It's a much more complicated enlargement piece than anything we faced before, when it was easy to integrate countries at a time when the security implications were low, when they were comparatively well ready to join the alliance, where defending them also, because their territory was contiguous to NATO territory, was comparatively easy as well. Georgia and Ukraine are key, because if we get that right, it's not only going to help them and defend them, we're also going to defend ourselves in the process by having them in the alliance, and it will be part of our ability to contain, but also cooperate with Russia over the longer run. And so that's going to be, to my mind, the end of the NATO enlargement process, because I agree with Andrew, given the limitations of the treaty and the limitations of candidates. Switzerland doesn't want to join the alliance, neither does Austria, neither does the Irish Republic. That will be the end of the story. But getting the story ended and completed with this final enlargement to Georgia and Ukraine will be the most delicate and the most difficult difficult. And to some degree, if we get that right, historically, it will validate retroactively the entire process of NATO enlargement. But if we get it wrong historically, it could put a big question mark over a lot of that process. And it's going to take time, but we need to keep the momentum going. The other thing I would say, when you talk about sort of partnerships in the love aspect, you talk about new loves and new partners, but sometimes you talk about, revitalizing old loves and old partners. And Andrew mentioned Sweden and Finland, and they are super partners of NATO, and they contribute to NATO in a way that allies alone do, even if they don't want to join. But we shouldn't, because we've had this wonderful partnership with those two Nordic countries over the last few years, we shouldn't sort of forget, others who were very enthusiastic partners in the early days, but maybe have gone a bit cold as they've seen NATO focus so much on Finland and Sweden. The Swiss, the Austrians, the Irish. I mean, Malta was in the partnership, no more. And those countries, have a lot to contribute, particularly the Swiss, in terms of cyber, in terms of humanitarian law, the protection of civilians and so on. So sometimes we also should try, to look at how we can revitalize some of these formats. Andrew mentioned, the Mediterranean dialogue. It's not been very dynamic. The Istanbul Cooperation Initiative, it's not been very dynamic. So, let's look a little bit. I mean, Saudi Arabia was a country which 1 minute was going to join the Istanbul Cooperation Initiative. It never did. So, NATO should pay as much attention to keeping old partnerships, like old love affairs, energized and vital, and not always just look upon it in terms of, picking up new lovers or new partners, because, our strategic interest sometimes is just keeping the existing relationship together. One final word concerns the African countries. I mean, some of the key partners in terms of Western security currently in North Africa. They're in the Sahel, they're in Libya, Egypt, Tunisia, the one successful country to emerge from the Arab Spring. They're very sensitive when it comes to NATO, particularly after Libya. But in terms of our security, reaching out into Northern Africa and dealing with jihadism and so many other kinds of threats, our ability to build bridges with those countries across deep cultural divides is also, I think, going to be a key test for the future. So that's all I wanted to say. But again, thanks to everybody. Leave it to Corey and to Andrew, Petra, to round off with you. But thanks again for letting me come on tonight. All the best.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Shea. It's been a true pleasure, and looking forward to welcoming you soon. And have a nice dinner. So to wrap up the whole panel, as we are now, I would like to refer it back to Corey, since we are on these operational objectives. So how exactly, in your perspective and having your experience in the field, how does increased gender awareness help NATO to meet its operational objectives when it comes to security and defense area, when it comes to international peace and cooperation in general?
Great. So I'm going to make this quite quick because I have an infant that needs to be fed, and I'm the only one in this household that can do it at present. So I would say that, this discussion of a gender awareness and a gender perspective, there's two components of it. One is looking at an institution and its composition and how it has removed barriers to allow women to rise through the ranks and meaningfully contribute in leadership positions. But this is not necessarily only for women. It's for people of color, for people from the LGBTQ community, so that different diverse perspectives do permeate discussions on global security and future security challenges. So NATO looking forward will certainly want to take every opportunity to make sure these types of perspectives permeate NATO's future-looking process. The more operational side of it is that gender is a key component of understanding human behavior and decision-making and power dynamics. And this is all very important information for military operations specifically. It helps us understand early warning indicators. For example, when we look at violence against women in certain countries, this is sort of the rumblings of instability that can be coming. And so it allows you to be more preventative as opposed to reactive when you can glean that information from an analysis. I think, sometimes it's really hard when we say apply a gender perspective, and really, if we can just get everybody to ask themselves the question, how will my action impact men and women differently? That is one first step that we can all do to really think through a gender perspective from a security perspective. And I think the final point that I'd advocate for, again, is that gender is a really great starting point, but really layering on other intersecting identity characteristics like race, ethnicity, religion, economic status. This helps us understand people and human complexity in myriad ways and gives us a lot more information to advance forward on our objectives. So with that, I thank you so much for letting me participate and inviting me to this conversation. It's been a great time. And congratulations to you on hosting a really great event for its day on Friday.
Well, thank you so much. I know it's a late Friday evening and we have the last wrap up of the day coming up, so I won't be taking any more of that time. But I would like to sincerely thank you one more time for joining me tonight and for being amazing speakers and for contributing so much. And I'm sure that our viewers have learned a lot and will be able to discuss this further in days to come. We've touched on many aspects when it comes to NATO external policies, from Taiwan, cyber, hybrid. All of them will be assessed and talked about in days to come. So I'll just invite everyone to join us tomorrow and on Sunday. I know it's the weekend, but it'll be worth it. On that note, I'll thank you all so much, and I'm looking forward to welcoming you both on a panel again. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Petra. It's been very enjoyable and very informative across